What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
I just wanted to quickly go through some draft day winners and losers. But first, let's get the bad news out of the way and just let's talk some losers first. And I really only have one major loser this year, and that's the broadcast, and more specifically, Kendrick Perkins. And before I get into the Perkins stuff, I just want to say I don't really understand the need to split up the draft coverage on two separate channels. Why do I have to choose between having my ears assaulted by Stephen A. Smith or a broadcast with Kendrick Perkins? To me, it just makes much more sense to have a more serious broadcast with guys like Jay Billis, JJ Redick, throw in some other college/draft experts. And then you can have the broadcast with guys like Stephen A. Smith and Perkins and some other former players just kind of shooting the shit for like a less serious broadcast. I feel like splitting the guys like Perkins and Stephen A., you end up with just the worst of both worlds. Like we all know that Perkins and Stephen A. aren't exactly breaking down film and really diving into college basketball. So I don't know what either of them are really adding individually to a broadcast, especially in a situation where Kendrick Perkins was almost on his own out there. If you want to do like the hot take thing, put all those guys together and just let them talk with the draft kind of in the background, and then the other broadcast could be more serious. Nobody really got what they wanted with the way that they had the broadcast set up this year. And speaking of Kendrick Perkins, boy, oh boy, some of the comps he came up with were wild. And sure, if I did some mental gymnastics, I could sort of get there with a few of them, but they were still pretty wild. So kicking things off for Perkins, we had Paolo Banchero go number one, and his comps for them were Michael Beasley and Ben Simmons. And first off, that is not what you want to hear as a Magic fan, the number one pick being compared to two complete disasters in terms of draft picks. But as far as the comps go, I do see the train of thought. Beasley was a three-level scorer at the power forward position, and Ben Simmons as a playmaker, but that's really where the comp ends for me. Beasley didn't have much off the dribble juice, whereas Paolo is a pretty stellar ball handler. He's able to create scoring opportunities for himself and others off the bounce. That really wasn't Beasley's game. And then as far as the Ben Simmons thing, it's also a little weird for me. Simmons is a pretty flashy passer as a playmaker, whereas Banchero is very much function over style. So I don't see it there. Next up, Chet Holmgren went to the Thunder, and this is where things kind of went off the rails. Perkins gave a Kristaps Porzingis and Giannis comp for Chet Holmgren. The Porzingis one is fine, I guess. I'm not a huge fan of that comp. Porzingis is definitely more of a big with some guard skills, whereas Chet feels more like a guard who is 7 feet tall. There's a big difference there. And so I guess I see why he made that comparison, but it just really isn't my favorite. The Giannis one is just hilarious to me. And I guess if I squint hard enough, I can see that they're both tall ball handlers, but that's just too much of a stretch to compare the most physically imposing player in the league, the evolutionary version of Shaq, to a 7-footer who weighs less than 200 pounds. That's just hilarious. The Jabari Smith one was fine, I guess. I mean, KD was the comp there, and that's a bit of a stretch. Jabari doesn't have the ISO off the dribble stuff that KD has, but as far as just shooting over the tops of defenses, I can see it. Then we had Jaden Ivey compared to Ja. Again, it's fine, I guess. I don't really like comparing anyone to Ja. He's like one of these generational type athletes, but I guess it makes as much sense as comparing like a Mustang to a Ferrari. Sure, they're both sports cars, but there are levels to this. And Ivy is an impressive athlete, absolutely, no question. And he still will be even on an NBA court, but Ja is just a different animal. There were some other really puzzling comps out there, but I guess looking back now, for the most part, they weren't all terrible. They just weren't quite right or weren't very well explained. It got a little silly, and they actually eventually just scrapped the whole Perkins giving comps thing and it was pretty early on. I feel like they didn't even get to 10 picks before they just completely had Perkins just kind of commenting on the picks and not making any comparisons. I guess the producers knew he basically had no idea who any of the guys were towards the back half of the lottery. So why let him embarrass himself out there by pulling comps out of his ass? But either way, I thought it was pretty funny. I got a kick out of it. The next loser I have is the Sacramento Kings. And while I don't think that them passing on Ivy is like a Marvin Bagley over Luka Doncic level mistake, I still think it's a pretty big mistake. And let me first of all say, I do like Keegan Murray. I think he's going to be a good player in this league for a long time. So in no way is this an indictment on him, but pretty much everyone in the basketball community agreed it was a top three. And then Jaden Ivey was the fourth at just like half a step down from the top three, being Chet, Paolo, and Jabari. And then there was a pretty steep drop off after Ivy in terms of potential as a prospect. So the Kings reaching for Keegan Murray at 4 is just very puzzling. So if I were to defend the Kings here, I would say that Ivy basically gave them no reason to draft him. He made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with the Kings. He refused to go work out for them. He wouldn't release his medical records. He didn't do an interview. Everything that he did just screamed, "Don't draft me." And then if I wanted to continue to be nice to the Kings, maybe they do think that Keegan Murray is a future superstar in this league. I mean, I don't agree, but maybe they're really high on him. And the reality is, if they had traded out of that 4th pick, he's likely going at minimum 6th to the Pacers. So it's not as if they could have traded back to that 11th pick with the Knicks or even further back, like with the Hawks or something, and still been able to draft Keegan Murray. But if they don't believe that he can be a superstar, like a number 1 or number 2 player on the title team, this doesn't make sense to me at all. And based on everything that I've read, the phone was ringing off the hook in Detroit once the Kings passed on Ivy. So it's not as if there weren't deals on the table there. So with weeks of prep time and time to work out a deal, why didn't the Kings get anything done here? I feel like most people see Keegan Murray's potential as like a future quality starter or at worst a role player. And he may never reach either of those levels. So as the Kings, if that's how you view him, why wouldn't you have used that 4th pick to trade for a proven quality starter? You're likely also going to be able to negotiate for future draft picks in that deal. So why didn't you get anything done? For the portion where they just passed on Ivy because they didn't like him as a player, I certainly see why they would have done that. If I were going to play psychologist here for a moment, I think they were worried about the optics of taking another small guard. They've pretty much done that every year for the past few years, and especially since they've been just absolutely torched by the NBA community for that Halliburton trade. So they were likely worried about how that would look having just traded Halliburton. I think they were also likely worried about the De'Aaron Fox fit alongside Ivy, which is just another reminder for Kings fans how this group traded the wrong guard at the trade deadline. Ivy would have been a near perfect fit alongside Halliburton. But I worrying about fit when you haven't made the playoffs in 16 years and have the 4th pick in the draft, that's just moronic to me. And I know that they moved up in the draft lottery, but you still got the 4th pick for a reason. You aren't good, you don't have a talented roster, and you don't have a roster that has a lot of potential future talent. So why wouldn't you just take the best guy available and worry about the fit later? Or hey, since you're hell-bent on making the play-in no matter the cost and at the expense of your future as a franchise, why wouldn't you trade the 4th pick for a proven player? Or since you knew that Detroit wanted to take Ivy, why wouldn't you threaten to take him and then trade either down to 5 or 6? You could have still drafted Keegan Murray, and at worst, you could have gotten at least a 2nd-round pick. Just get something, anything, if you're going to pass up on a consensus number 4 pick. This was just the worst of both worlds for the Kings, and they continue to just strengthen their case for the least competent franchise in professional sports. My next loser is the New York Knicks, and for me, this draft night for them, it just tells me that they aren't learning from their mistakes at all. There were plenty of players on the board at 11 who could have really helped them, but instead they elected to basically draft cap space. Now that's fine in a vacuum, and I actually think it was a pretty decent haul for the 11th pick, and the haul that they ended up getting back in that weird Hornets Pistons Knicks trade, also not bad. The problem is the money that they cleared up, aka Kemba Walker, is rectifying a mistake that they made last offseason, just last offseason. Everyone in the league knew it was pretty much over for Kemba Walker, yet they elected to overpay to get him and gave him a multiple year deal. And now they're being forced to give up draft picks just to get out of it. If they hadn't overpaid to acquire Evan Fournier, overpaid Kemba Walker, overpaid Julius Randle, overpaid Derrick Rose, overpaid Nerlens Noel and Taj Gibson, all just last offseason, they wouldn't be scrambling now and giving away assets just to get out of those deals. So forgive me if I'm not jumping up and down over that. And also, like the Kings, who I just mentioned previously, the Knicks seem to think they're a lot closer than they actually are in terms of being a competitive playoff team. So what good is this cap space actually going to do them? The plan for them seems to be acquire Jalen Brunson, maybe Kyrie Irving, although they seem a lot less interested in Kyrie than Brunson. So let's just create this perfect world, this perfect Knicks world where they actually are able to sign Brunson. Are you even going to the playoffs with RJ Barrett and Jalen Brunson as your top two players? I don't think so. The East has gotten really competitive now, so I don't even think you would be guaranteed a play-in spot, much less an actual playoffs spot with that team. So let's work something else out for the Knicks. Let's continue concocting this perfect world, and let's have them trade for Donovan Mitchell. And it would be a move where they'd have to give up RJ Barrett and a lot of that draft capital that they just picked up from these trades they made. So where are you going with Brunson and Mitchell as your two key players and depleted depth on your team? I think maybe a play-in, but that's about it. Even if we have them sign Kyrie in place of Brunson and they get this perfect version of Kyrie where he's locked in, he's invested, he stays healthy, none of which are given by any stretch. Kyrie and Mitchell with a crummy surrounding roster isn't getting you too far in the East. Miami, Milwaukee, Boston, all of those teams are guaranteed to be better, in my opinion. Then you have Chicago, Philly, the Nets. All of those teams have a lot up in the air. They could potentially be much better than a Brunson or Kyrie and Mitchell-led Knicks team. But barring a complete calamity in the offseason from any of those three teams I just mentioned, I think at best you're around their level. Then you have Atlanta, Toronto, and Cleveland, still really young teams. And I think at worst, they're around the level of this potential Knicks team I just created. But if any of them take a big step forward, I think they could absolutely be better than a Kyrie and Donovan Mitchell-led Knicks team. So at best, the absolute best case scenario, the Knicks are a fourth seed. And that's banking on teams like Philly, Chicago, the Nets taking steps back, and those young teams out east not really moving forward or maybe taking a potential step back. But the likely reality is far worse for the Knicks. And it's one that we've seen play out time and time again with this Knicks organization. It's the one where they strike out on their first choices free agency wise, and they're going to be forced to overpay just like they did offseason for guys like Kemba Walker, Evan Fournier, Noel, and company. So the real question is, do Knicks fans riot if either Zhang or Duran become awesome and the Knicks, all they have to show for in their free agency is guys like Lou Williams and Serge Ibaka? The last loser I have is Jabari Smith, and I know it's kind of weird to name a player, especially since I actually think that the Rockets did a pretty good job in this year's draft. So what do I mean? Well, it seemed like Jabari had all the momentum going his way to be the number one pick this year. So it has to be disappointing for him to fall to 3. But outside of that, I'm also concerned about the basketball fit portion of Jabari on this Rockets team. Listen, even if it is a bad fit for Jabari Smith, he'll be fine. His skill set pretty much guarantees him to have a 10-year career at least in this league, health withstanding, as at least a solid player. But whether or not he can take the next step as a player, that's the question. Whether he can be the type of player who can be the number 1 or number 2 option on a title team developmentally with this Rockets group is what has me worried. Jabari Smith isn't really the type of player who you can just give the ball to and watch him create offense. His ball handling and passing vision, they just aren't at a high enough level. So he's going to need to have shots and opportunities created for him to really thrive. And the guards here in Houston, sort of like what he played alongside of at Auburn, they're going to look for their own scoring first. And that's going to be sometimes to the detriment of Jabari and the rest of the team. At Auburn, there were huge stretches of the game where Jabari Smith just wouldn't touch the ball, and it was no fault of his own. So at Auburn, it didn't even look as good as it could have for Jabari. So with Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, is he going to be right back in that Auburn situation all over again? It's looking likely. And if that's the case, and he's having to fight for touches and fight for chances to be the primary creator, is that going to stunt his growth at all? I think it would have been better if he had played on a team where they had kind of the bandwidth to give him chances to create so that he can develop that playmaking and shot creating aspect of his game. Or if he had gone to a situation where he's playing with guards who are great at setting the table for others, like Shea and Gideon, Oklahoma City. The Rockets are going to have to address this in free agency. They need to bring in a veteran playmaker who can set the table and control how the touches are going to be distributed here so that everyone has room to grow and develop. It's a little bit like having teachers monitor the students during lunchtime at like an elementary school. You just need to have an adult in the room to make sure that the bully doesn't take all the other kids' lunches. Just like that, Jabari's going to need a chance to eat too here in Houston. Now let's move on to the more positive side of things, the winners. And let me first say that most teams, I actually thought, did a pretty good job of drafting this year. So if there's a team or a player that you think won on draft night, I likely don't disagree, but let me know who it is and why you feel that way down in the comments section. But the first winner I have is a combination of both the Pistons and Jaden Ivey. For the Ivey piece of this is a match made in heaven for him. Ivey just isn't quite the lead guard, in my opinion, but he also isn't the type of player who can play exclusively off the ball. So for him to end up in a situation where he's paired in the backcourt with a tall, unselfish point guard like Cade Cunningham, that's just a perfect fit. Cade is perfectly capable of playing off the ball when you want to let Ivey create or run pick and roll. And on the flip side, Cade is a pretty special passer. So when Ivey does some of those crazy off-ball cuts or wants a lob, Cade is perfectly capable of hitting him with an on-time and on-target pass. That fit alone is obviously a huge win for the Pistons, but they also added Jalen Duren for really cheap, first in 2025. That seems insane for a guy that like 15 to 20 years ago would have been unquestionably the first pick in this draft. Duren is a freak of nature athletically, and he's shown some real flashes as a passer. So he has the chance to be special, but I think in the worst case scenario, he is going to give both Cade and Ivey an ultra athletic pick and roll partner. And I actually heard that the Pistons plan to take Duren at 5 if Ivey ended up going to the Kings. So for them to get both of their targets here is just a huge win. I'm not going to completely give the GM his flowers because a lot of this just kind of fell in his lap, but still a good job to capitalize on the opportunities there. And sure, the Pistons gave up Jeremy Grant to acquire that pick, but to end up with a specimen like Jalen Duren, I think it's no question this is a huge win for Pistons fans. And now all of a sudden, the Pistons have a really solid young core with guys like Saddiq Bey, Cade Cunningham, Ivey, Duren, Isaiah Stewart. And it really hasn't been a very long turnaround time for where the Pistons committed to blowing this thing up. It really hasn't taken that long for them to get back on track. My last winner is 2K players. They are now, I'm sure, overjoyed and can rejoice over Chet joining forces with Poku. If the Thunder end up signing Bol Bol, it's all over. But in all seriousness, Chet is a huge winner here. He landed in absolutely the perfect scenario for him. When I did my prospect breakdown of Chet Holmgren, I talked about how A, he needs time to grow and develop, and B, he's going to need a front office and a coaching staff that have a really clear vision of how they want him to develop and how they want to use him. Oklahoma City seems to have no designs of winning anytime soon. So he's going to be able to take his time developmentally. And since Oklahoma City is not New York or LA, if he has that 1 for 10 shooting night, it won't be plastered all over ESPN the next day. Also, Oklahoma City is committed and has a track record of success with developmental type players. Shea and Giddey, neither are conventional guards, but they've made it work. And even if you go back to like Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, Russ was as raw of a prospect as they come when he was drafted by Oklahoma City, but they were able to turn him into a year after year all-star caliber player. And particularly with Durant, and I'm not saying that Chet is going to be Durant, but both are painfully thin and weird in terms of trying to fit them into the predetermined roles that we have in the NBA. If the Thunder had said, Durant, you're a stretch four, go stand in the corner, it obviously wouldn't have worked out nearly as well as it has. Even guys like Serge Ibaka, Steven Adams, they were seen as more project type players, but Oklahoma City took their time and developed them with intention and a vision in mind. This isn't going to be the case of like Tyreek Evans or Ben McLemore with the Kings or Michael Beasley with the Heat, a situation where it was just the wrong team for one reason or another. Chet is in the right situation, and it's just going to be a matter of, can he stay healthy and is he going to put in the work? Now, you might have noticed I didn't mention Oklahoma City as a winner like I did for the Pistons. And in a vacuum, they were a winner. If you look at this draft alone by itself, they had a really good draft. But I'm just concerned about the direction of the team. I think it's entirely possible that they bit off a little bit more than they can chew in terms of player development. Chet's a project. Poku's a project. This year, they end up trading up to get Ousmane Dieng, who's going to be a project. Dort and Giddey, despite being good players, they're still somewhat works in progress and are likely going to want the ball more. Shea is likely going to be gunning for an all-star spot, an all-NBA slot. And then you have Trey Mann, who's shown flashes of being a real player. And regardless of how I feel about any of these guys, that's a lot to take on from a developmental perspective. It's going to be basically impossible to feature all of those guys, all of those players enough and give them the touches that they need to really develop. It's a little bit like taking on a landscaping project. If you went out into your backyard and just tried to plant a ton of big oak trees close together, A, they probably don't all survive, and B, even if they do, none of those trees are going to grow as tall as they could have if they weren't competing for like sunlight, water, nutrients, those sorts of things. Whereas if you went out there and you planted just a few oak trees kind of spread out, then you added some bushes and some flowers, just a variety of things, the plants there are much more likely to flourish. Basketball teams are very much the same. There are jobs and roles that have to be filled for the team to be successful, and only so many opportunities in each role to go around. So you need a variety of players who can fill different roles in order for guys to develop and grow, and in order for that team to be successful. Chet, Dieng, Giddey, Shea, Poku, Mann, all are guys that the Thunder seem to want to turn into playmakers, but there aren't going to be enough consistent touches to go around for any of them to really develop that aspect of their game if you're going to divide it up equally. The reality is the names I just mentioned are, some of them at least, are going to likely need to be moved or looked at from a different perspective on the developmental side of things. But I think Oklahoma City, they're a good organization, so I'm sure they're going to figure it out, but it's still an area of concern for me. But let me know how you guys felt about the draft. How did you feel about what your team did? Who were the winners and losers and why? Let me know down in the comment section.